and welcome to Baltimore. As much as I would like to be there with you today, I'm sorry that I cannot join you in person as you once again gather in my wife's memory for the annual Judith Hoyer Epilepsy Lecture. I want to thank the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Strokes, headed by Dr. Landis, and all of the sponsoring organizations: the Epilepsy Foundation, American Epilepsy Society, Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy, the Epilepsy Therapy Project, and the Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance, and many others who never lose sight of our common goal to find a cure for epilepsy. I'm excited to learn that all of you have been working together through Vision 2020 toward an IOM report on the public health aspects of epilepsy. I'm certain it will yield very useful information and updates to help guide us as we make progress in our work to help individuals who live with epilepsy and their families. As long as I'm in the Congress, I will continue to fight for funding and legislation that helps improve the lives of those suffering from epilepsy and seeks a cure so that others will not be affected in the future. Though there may be debate across the aisle on funding levels and timetables, members in both parties recognize that we must work together to provide adequate and appropriate funding for the NIH and the CDC to conduct research and surveillance on epilepsy. With nearly 3 million Americans living with epilepsy, we must have more options for treatment. Sometimes these are not just medical options, but reach more broadly to improve the well-being of the whole patient. Dr. Stephen Schachter, your keynote speaker today, will share his research into the role that arts can play in medicine. I know there is also a special treat for everyone today, so you can experience firsthand the value of the arts as a therapy tool, and how one person's vision can change the world for so many. I especially want to thank you, Cynthia, and your daughter Lydia for making this possible. I wish you all a productive and enjoyable conference, and I hope that you will also have a chance to explore some of Baltimore while you're here. Thank you.
So thanks, Congressman. You were like reading from my script, so I can shorten what I'm going to say. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Schachter. He's our Judith Hoyer Lecturer on Epilepsy. He's a professor of neurology at Harvard University, and he's dedicated his career to finding new therapies for people with epilepsy. He's a recognized expert in the design and implementation of clinical research in epilepsy. Since 1986, he's been a principal investigator for nearly 70 clinical research studies of different anti-epileptic drugs, devices, and novel therapies. Throughout his career, he's always been interested in breaking new ground. In '88, he helped launch the Office of Clinical Trials and Research at Harvard Beth Israel Deaconess, and he became a founder of the Harvard Clinical Research Institute in 2000. He also founded in 2000 the journal Epilepsy and Behavior, and more recently, he established a national products research program in epilepsy as part of Harvard Medical School's Division of Research and Education in Complementary and Integrative Medical Therapies. He's a dedicated teacher and mentor. He served as an advisor and leader for numerous professional and nonprofit organizations, and recently became the director for neurotechnology and the chief academic officer for the Center for Integrative Medicine and Innovative Technology, which I used to know as CIMIT, which is, it has the same, an acronym, but it had a different set of words going along with it in the old days. But anyway, this consortium of Boston's leading teaching hospitals and universities forces collaboration in translational research, medicine, science, and engineering with the goal of improving patient care. And outside his academic achievements, Dr. Schachter is perhaps best known for conceiving and editing and compiling the acclaimed Brainstorms book series, and for publishing a volume of art from persons living with epilepsy. These books explain and explore epilepsy in a new way and offer us insight and perspective from patients, families, and healthcare professionals. And that, of course, brings us to today's lecture, which is a very special treat. Dr. Schachter's remarks will focus on the social, behavioral, and psychiatric aspects of epilepsy. He'll highlight recent scientific findings in these fields, but he will use art and the unique music of Cynthia Folio, a talented composer and musician, and an associate professor of music theory at Temple University, and the mother of Lydia, who has epilepsy in association with her TS. Inspired by Lydia's experiences, she created the acclaimed multimedia presentation called When the Spirit Catches You, which we will enjoy after Dr. Schachter's remarks. So talk quickly, Steve. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Steve Schachter to present the 9th Judith Hoyle Lecture on Psychosocial Aspects of Epilepsy, the State of the Art, together with the Baltimore premiere of When the Spirit Catches You, performed by the Philadelphia's Grammy-nominated Roulash Ensemble and presented by Dr. Cynthia Folio and her daughter Lydia. Thanks.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Representative Hoyer. And as we file off the stage, it's a real privilege to invite Steve here. As you know, just a few years ago, he read the scripts that I read today and did a better job. Steve's a real friend. He's just reached out to so many people, so many physicians, so many patients, so many others that he's touched. I was inspired by Walter's comments. You know, we have to keep up the fight. And to help us take a different perspective, I turn it over to Steve Schachter. Steve.
Thank you very much, Jack and Walter, for the kind introduction. Good morning. The title of my talk is The Psychosocial Aspects of Epilepsy, State of the Art, and I think you now have a bit of a preview as to the double meaning of the phrase state of the art. As a representative said, and Walter reiterated, the purpose of the Judith Hoyer Lecture is to raise awareness of epilepsy among researchers as well as the general public, and to provide intellectual stimulation that will encourage continuing progress towards finding a cure for epilepsy through research. Why is this important? Well, we have many urgent needs for more research, as we all know. We have no cures for epilepsy yet. We have no ways to prevent epilepsy in people at high risk. Persons with epilepsy are at significant risk for increased mortality, for drug-resistant seizures, unacceptable side effects from existing therapies, and the disabling psychosocial and medical comorbidities that many people with epilepsy have. In addition, we need more research into the public health dimensions of epilepsy, and this is currently being undertaken by the Institute of Medicine. Some time ago, the epilepsy community came together and charted a course by which we hope we would begin to answer some of these pressing questions. And the community identified these particular aspects as important methods and strategies towards finding a cure for epilepsy. Better understanding what happens in the brain to create epileptic seizures. New ways to prevent epilepsy. New treatments that eliminate seizures without side effects. And reducing the day-to-day impact of epilepsy. Now, much progress has been made in each of these particular areas. The focus of my remarks this morning, my Judith Hoyer lecture, is the last of those bullet points, the day-to-day impact of epilepsy. And my approach and my premise in this talk is that artwork and music created by persons living with epilepsy themselves or affected by epilepsy through their family can both illustrate research as well as inspire research to better understand and eliminate the day-to-day impact of epilepsy. And in presenting the creative works of people living with epilepsy, it underscores the importance of the perspective of people themselves affected by epilepsy in the research effort. Now, why is this topic important to researchers? Well, I quote William Lennox, who was none other than AES's first president 75 years ago, Jack. And he and a colleague, Bill Markham, wrote in JAMA in 1953 that those of us who study epilepsy and who treat patients must match modern drug and surgical therapy with practical socio-psychological therapy. Oh my God, there's my picture up there. Can we cut that, please? I'm having an out-of-body experience, I think. And by going beyond the medications and the serum levels and the surgery to be concerned not only with these turbulent brainwaves, but also with disturbed emotions. And I think those remarks now, almost 50 or 60 years ago, really could be the headline of my presentation. I too want to express my gratitude to the supporters of the Hoyer Lecture, NINDS, CURE, the Epilepsy Foundation, the Epilepsy Therapy Project, the TS Alliance, and the American Epilepsy Society. And I also want to mention that for the first time this year, thanks to the donors and the efforts of ETP, the Hoyer Lecture is being recorded and will be made available on the World Wide Web for the public and researchers around the world. Of course, I'd also like to thank the artists here in this country as well as around the world who have shared their work with me and now with you, as well as their physicians, many of whom have made it possible for their artwork to be brought to your attention, as well as colleagues who have embraced this approach towards enlightening all of us on the personal impact of epilepsy. Just a couple brief words by way of background about the art that I'll be showing you. It's almost 20 years now that I have had an interest in the art of people with epilepsy. This began in the context of a show called From the Storm that launched in Boston in 1993. It was begun by an artist, herself with epilepsy, who owned an art gallery in Boston. And I was very pleased to be able to help with the show and then to take this show of some 30 or 40 artists' works on the road. And we traveled through North America and Canada and ultimately made our way to Sydney, Australia for the International Epilepsy Congress in 1995. And since then, I've been receiving works of art from canvases through digital files by people with epilepsy, by their physicians, and have used art to create the book that you see the cover of, to illustrate covers of Epilepsy and Behavior and other books, and in any way possible to bring the message, the many messages in this art, to the attention of the professional society as well as the public. And I think I counted nearly 1,300 total pieces of artwork that I now have in various forms, and almost 60 artists. So in approaching the topic of the day-to-day impact of epilepsy, I'd like to focus on 5 particular themes. The experience of seizures and the experience of treatments from the point of view of people who have seizures and who are taking these therapies. Mood disorders, one of the most common and disabling comorbidities. The impact of having a child with epilepsy. Living with seizures, living with the diagnosis of epilepsy is the 4th topic, and the 5th is leading a happy and fulfilling life to achieve the vision of ILAE that we heard from Nico, which is a world in which no person's life is limited by epilepsy. And then we'll have a musical segue to a very special and unique musical performance. So for the first topic, experiencing seizures and treatment. What do people perceive and feel during seizures? Why is this important? Well, the subjective seizure experiences that individuals with epilepsy have understandably influence to them what it means to have epilepsy. And sometimes they may not have any perception of the seizure itself, but the postictal state, and we'll come to that in a couple of minutes. And as important as this is, it's notable that there really is very little research that has been done into the actual subjective experiences of an individual having seizures. And this is understandable because these are subjective. And how can one measure these? And so the studies that have been done are typically based on personal accounts or on ictal EEG or ictal neuroimaging studies. There are several types of seizure experiences that have been able to be studied. The first I'll mention are visual auras. Visual auras which are static or flashing or moving lights. They can take different shapes, different patterns, different colors, and these typically reflect ictal activation of the primary visual cortex or nearby visual association areas. And as I show you some of the paintings done by people with epilepsy now who have had visual auras, you can get a sense of the nature of these experiences, which totally take over their conscious experience when they occur. These visual auras come on paroxysmally and prevent the individual from seeing what is around them. Another type of seizure experience is what's called facial metamorphopsia, which means a sensation or an illusion where faces appear distorted. And this has been localized to the face recognition region in the brain. And here's a photograph by a person with epilepsy, which has been contrived to illustrate this phenomenon where a person's face that you're looking at becomes distorted during the seizure. And here's another example of that phenomenon. And the third subjective seizure experience is known as autoscopy, an example of which would be the out-of-body illusion. And this has been found recently to arise from temporoparietal regions. Patients may not discuss this spontaneously with their physician because they may be concerned that the physician may not take them seriously, the feeling that they, during a seizure, are literally leaving their body, but yet this happens. And here's a very dramatic painting by, in fact, the Boston artist I mentioned earlier, showing a head distinctly separated from the body, illustrating this phenomenon of the out-of-body experience. There's also intense pain and heat that this individual feels as well during her seizures. Now, as I mentioned, some people have no recollection of the seizure itself, but do remember the post-ictal period or experience symptoms during the post-ictal period. And so what do people perceive? What do they feel during the immediate period following a seizure, what we call the post-ictal period? There are a number of symptoms. They can range from cognitive, emotional symptoms, such as memory loss, confusion, depression, sadness, fear, shame, embarrassment, or certainly physical consequences such as injuries from the seizure itself, exhaustion, sleepiness, headache, nausea, and weakness. And post-ictal symptoms like seizure experiences color the impression of patients' experience of epilepsy, what it means to them to have epilepsy, and do have a significant impact on their quality of life. We're recognizing this more and more by focusing on post-ictal symptoms in research. Yet the research that has been done on the post-ictal state is limited. And while a seizure may last just a few minutes, the post-ictal period may last minutes to hours, perhaps even days. And for many patients, more seriously disrupt their life than the seizure itself, and yet we know far too little about the post-ictal period and the underlying mechanisms. Among the studies that have been done include the work of Andy Canner, in which he found that nearly half of patients with drug-resistant epilepsy experienced a number of symptoms of depression for a median duration of 24 hours after more than half their seizures. And about 1 in 8 of these patients had suicidal ideation in the postictal period. And here's a very telling drawing showing obvious depressed mood. And this sense of depression can last as long as 100 hours, Dr. Kanner found in his research. There's much we have to learn, though, about the postictal state. Here's a quote from a patient that's in one of the Brainstorms books. And she says, "After I have a seizure, I get an overwhelming feeling, overwhelming sense that everything I know intellectually to be in the present is distant in time and space, like the sort of sense associated with the recollection of an old memory. I have a powerful sense of anguish, pain, and loneliness." And for her, this is what it means to have a seizure. This is the first thing she remembers. And what's the visual and spatial perception that goes along with this? It's this horrific reality, which she has drawn here, a mutilated body floating above earth, tethered to ground by what looks like an umbilical cord. This, for her, is the reality of a seizure and her actual reality during the postictal period. And no wonder that she lived in constant fear of having a seizure. How can this happen? What part of the brain is allowing this to happen? And what can we do to prevent it? If we can't stop the seizure, can we treat the postictal period in some way? So moving on then from the ictal and postictal experiences, how do side effects from medications impact daily life? Now there's more research that has been done, and increasingly so in this particular area. And what we know is that anti-epileptic drug side effects do have a significant impact on day-to-day quality of life of people with epilepsy. Bob Fisher and colleagues clearly demonstrated this through large surveys of people with epilepsy years ago. Gus Baker and his colleagues studied over 5,000 persons with epilepsy in Europe, and 88% had at least one side effect. Now here's a picture that shows double vision. And how many of us as physicians have asked the question, well, have you had double vision? And yeah, I have double vision. And just check the box off that this is the symptom that they had, not fully mindful of the how uncomfortable and unpleasant one of side effect double vision may be. I mean, if we cross our eyes so that things are double, you can get a sense of this. And imagine living with this day in and day out, for long periods of time. And one can't help but look at this picture and begin to understand the meaning of one of many side effects from medications. Now let's move on to mood disorders. One of the most common and under-recognized comorbidities of epilepsy. What are the interrelationships between depression, for example, and epilepsy? And to what extent does depression affect the lives of persons with epilepsy? Well, recent research is indicating that there is a bidirectional relationship between epilepsy and depression, also with suicidality. This bidirectional relationship means it can start with depression and lead to epilepsy, or start with epilepsy and lead to depression. And Hippocrates, a famous Greek physician from many centuries ago, recognized this as well. So a large number of research studies now are indicating that patients with depression, with depressive disorders, have a 3- to 7-fold higher risk of developing epilepsy. And this has now been demonstrated as well in older patients as well as in drug-resistant epilepsy in particular. Conversely, depressive disorders occur in up to 55 or 60% of patients, particularly with drug-resistant epilepsy, and perhaps as many as 10% of patients who have full seizure control, and who we otherwise, as physicians, might think that everything is fine. But as our colleagues have told us time and time again, depressive disorders among people with epilepsy are under-recognized and undertreated. Dr. Kanner has identified possible pathogenic mechanisms underlying the bidirectional relationship, outlined this in a recent review article. These include a hyperactive hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, a hormonal underpinning, or disturbances in a number of neurotransmitter systems, including serotonin, noradrenergic, GABAergic, and glutamatergic systems. And neuroimaging work is showing brain structural changes that can occur with depression or epilepsy, affecting parts of the brain that are known to mediate mood and particularly depressed affect. We are also learning through research that depression in patients with epilepsy often coexists with anxiety, and the coexistence of depression and anxiety may be a particular risk factor for suicidality. And both, independently as well as together, are associated with poor health-related quality of life. This has also been recently demonstrated in seniors with epilepsy, which is important because this is the fastest growing segment of the population with new onset epilepsy. Surprisingly, I think, to us, when these results came out, is that the impact on quality of life of depression and anxiety exceeds the impact on quality of life of seizures themselves. Suicide is one of the most common causes of death among persons with epilepsy. We heard another earlier from Walter, SUDEP. The risk of suicide is elevated nearly 30-fold in the presence of a mood disorder in a person with epilepsy. And, again, surprisingly, perhaps, it is also significantly increased in the first 6 months following the diagnosis of epilepsy. Now let's take a look at some of the art. This, again, is could be viewed as a self-portrait of a person with epilepsy and the associated depression. This very interesting picture shows what appears to be a transition of mood from sadness to happiness and everything in between. This reminds us that depression in people with epilepsy is atypical in some ways and has more of a dysthymic quality to it, and that this can, in fact, cycle fairly quickly over the course of days. And a picture representing anxiety, the sense of fear, of impending doom, of being of facing something that is potentially life-threatening. Moving on then to the third topic, the impact on parents. What is the impact as a parent of having a child with epilepsy? Well, Frank Bisag, who's here in the audience, and his colleagues studied this and found that parents may be terrified by watching their child have a seizure and think at that moment that their child was dying or will die. This initial fright and experience may stay with the parents for quite some time. Other work that's been done more recently has demonstrated the extent to which parents struggle on a day-to-day basis with a variety of issues, from fear on behalf of their child, stress, and depression, and the concerns that parents have about navigating the healthcare system, which is not straightforward, particularly for a child with a chronic condition like epilepsy, of being an advocate for their child in the educational system, for example, and the way in which family roles are changed when a child has epilepsy. Now let's look at some of the art. This is this is the bottom right-hand corner of a famous painting by Rubens called Transfiguration. This was painted in 1604, so well before AES and ILAE were founded. And what you see here is a child in the middle, in the midst of a seizure, a very accurately portrayed seizure, in fact. But the reason I'm showing this at this point in time is the parents, the look of fear and helplessness in the faces of the parents, which, I credit the artist and his apprentices, whoever actually painted these figures, because it was clear that they had, in their lifetime, seen parents and watch their child have a seizure. It's also clear that they had seen someone having a seizure multiple times, because the number of details that are captured artistically in this child are quite extraordinary. Tragically, sometimes a child with epilepsy will die, and this is a very powerful, emotional painting done by Leonard Lear, a well-known American artist, whose daughter, Anna Katrina, died from complications associated with epilepsy. The title of the painting is Anna Katrina Entering Heaven. And from the bottom up, you see Anna Katrina in the aftermath of a seizure. She lived in a persistent vegetative state for quite some time. As you go up the image, you see an EEG in blue, and ultimately entering heaven in this painting. And I happen to have one of these in my office, and it just keeps me focused on what we need to do in our work. Here are stained glass pyramids by Trish Barnes, who's here in our audience. These were made by Trish in memory of her son Kevin, who drowned 10 years ago from a seizure while swimming. Kevin would have been 27 years old next week. Through these pyramids, Trish hopes to help raise money for epilepsy research. Now, moving on then to the individual with epilepsy, what is it like to live in society with epilepsy? What are the issues faced by people with the diagnosis, independent of the seizures themselves? The first topic I'd like to focus on is the issue of stigma. How pervasive and how impactful are stigma? And we distinguish two different types of stigma. Perceived stigma, which is what the individual, in this case with epilepsy, thinks others are thinking about him or herself. Perceived stigma. And how impactful is enacted stigma, which is actual active discrimination or an action taken against somebody with epilepsy because of their diagnosis. Coming back to the study of Gus Baker and over 5,000 people with epilepsy, over half of these individuals felt stigmatized by their condition. And Ann Jacoby and others have clearly documented through research that perceived stigma or enacted stigma reduce self-esteem of the person with epilepsy and negatively impact their quality of life. Take a look at this photograph. This is a very insightful photograph that carries the message of perceived stigma. Remember, perceived stigma is what the individual with epilepsy imagines or believes that others are thinking about them, whether or not it's true. And often it isn't true, as shown in this photograph. So here a person with epilepsy is in the middle of the photograph, dressed as a clown in a crowded public space. He's dressed like a clown because he feels that because of his epilepsy, people around him think he's a clown, think he's different, that he believes they're stigmatized in their opinion towards him. But the reality, as you look at the people in this public space, no one is actually looking at him. No one is really taking notice of him. So this is perceived stigma. And often, if a patient who I'm seeing is struggling with this concept but can't quite put words to it, we might show them this photograph, and that can help illustrate this phenomenon. And it can be just as disabling and life-limiting as actual or enacted stigma. Now, these days it's politically incorrect, fortunately, to make fun of people with epilepsy, although from time to time we still see this happening on TV shows, and we're understandably outraged by this. But there was a time when it was more publicly acceptable to make fun of people with epilepsy. This is a cartoon from a French magazine that would be like the equivalent of Life magazine or Look magazine in this country, showing people with epilepsy at a epileptic colony where people were literally sent out of sight, out of mind, at a time when it was felt that you could catch epilepsy by watching somebody have a seizure. And these people are in the midst of some dance or some convulsive movements, and this was intended to be funny to the general public because it was consistent with the ridicule that was acceptable at that time towards people with epilepsy. Stigma can make people feel certainly different, below the surface of society, isolated, alone, undervalued. Here we see St. Valentine, who's one of the patron saints of epilepsy. People with epilepsy in this picture reaching up from below ground level, literally reaching up to be brought into mainstream society by St. Valentine. The day in the life of an artist with epilepsy, isolated and alone from sunrise to sunset, with cracks in the road representing gaps of time associated with this person's seizures. Very lonely experience. Much of the art that I have conveys the sensation of isolation, of loneliness, even being alone despite people being around you. For some of our patients, the only place they may feel safe is in their own bedroom, in their own home, or for some of our patients in our offices, where they feel understood, valued, and made to feel like people. Another aspect of living with epilepsy is called locus of control. What is locus of control for persons with epilepsy, and what is its relationship to mood disorders, to self-empowerment, and to quality of life? Locus of control is a concept that means, who do you believe is in charge of your life? Is it from within? Do you believe that you have control over important events and experiences in your life? If so, we localize your locus of control internally. Or do you feel your life is controlled by fate, by luck, by others, by powerful forces who control your life? That's external locus of control. And in the case of a person with epilepsy, the powerful force can be the seizures. Now, what has been found through research is that people with epilepsy who have an external locus of control, who believe that their lives are being controlled from external forces or from their epilepsy, are understandably more likely to have drug-resistant epilepsy, as well as high anxiety scores as measured by the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale. The concepts of self-mastery and self-efficacy are markers for internal locus of control, and it has been found that self-mastery mediates the connection between epilepsy severity and quality of life. So if we can help a person with epilepsy become more self-empowered, then they will have an improved quality of life and as well as improved mood. Now, the next series of slides I show will help to illustrate this point of external locus of control. Imagining waking up from a seizure, which is the perspective of this painting. You're flat on your back. People are looking down at you. Witnesses, onlookers, they're literally looking down at you, but they're also figuratively looking down at you. And you can imagine what that symbolic perspective may do to a person in their sense of self-esteem. The seizure as the external force that threatens the life of a person with epilepsy. Here you can infer that she believes she will drown if she has a seizure and the spike waves come on her EEG and she's unable to hold on. This artist is questioning to what extent his life, his being is controlled by his seizures, by his EEG, for example. A somewhat more artful rendition of an EEG, but nonetheless, pictures like this suggesting that the waves of brain waves can, be potentially powerful and influential over a person's life, as in the tidal wave. The daily reminders of epilepsy, which again, factor into a sense of what's controlling your life. In this case, it's the pills in the bottle, in the dispenser pack. Rubik's cubes, if each of the faces of each of these cubes is a possible daily experience, who is it that's manipulating the Rubik's cube that will determine what that day will be like for that individual with epilepsy? Dennis, with apologies to you and the other neurosurgeons in the audience, what impact does the surgeon have who's operating on the brain of a person with epilepsy? And being equal opportunity for the physicians here who prescribe medications, the patient may equate you with the external force that's in control of a person's life. And the editorial comment here on the pocket of the physician, if you can read it, it says pharmaceutical companies. As technology advances and we make further advances with seizure prediction, seizure detection, we're implanting hardware of various sorts into patients. This too may factor into their external locus of control, and I think that's a very perceptive and forward-looking message of this particular artist's self-portrait. And the last section then is leading a fulfilling life. If we are to work towards a world in which no person's life is limited by epilepsy, what will that mean? How can people with epilepsy live to their full potential and lead a happy and fulfilling life? Well, we do know through work, particularly of Ann Jacoby, that an excellent quality of life is possible for people with epilepsy, particularly those with well-controlled seizures. And efforts are now just beginning to help us understand how all people with epilepsy can achieve well-being and happiness in their lives. And the art that I now show is less about the day-to-day impact of epilepsy on the lives of people with epilepsy, and more about the impact that beautiful art has on our day-to-day lives. As we experience these artworks, hopefully it reinforces our belief that people with epilepsy are capable of wonderful accomplishments. This says, by the way, just kiss a pig. That they may be productive, creative people, uniquely contributing to society. And it reminds us, as we all know here, but nonetheless the message still needs to get out that people with epilepsy are not to be defined by their disorder, but rather by the people that they are. This is called sardines in German. This is a quilt, although you wouldn't put this over you in a bed, but this is made of Coke cans linked to one another. Epilepsy is often called a hidden disability. We hear that phrase a lot because there may be no visible indications of epilepsy in between seizures. I think what this wonderful art suggests to us is that many people with epilepsy, many people that we see as patients, that we know with epilepsy, may have hidden abilities that have not yet been able to be expressed. And my hope is that we can all continue to work together to discover these abilities and to enable their expression. We'll all be the beneficiaries of that. This is a piece of art that I brought back with me from Nanjing, China, where I was just a month or two ago, and came across an art exhibit by people with epilepsy in China. And thanks to Jim Chambliss, I learned that De Chirico, the Italian artist who's credited with starting the field of surrealism, had epilepsy. And we visited his studio in Rome at the recent International Congress and had a wonderful experience there, looking at his art and going through his writings. Another image from the Chinese exhibit that I saw. The art of persons with epilepsy hopefully inspires all of us to more completely understand the full day-to-day impact of epilepsy, understanding what may be possible to achieve. We must increase and accelerate the research into the day-to-day impact of epilepsy so that hopefully not too long from now, someday soon, each person with epilepsy will be able to live to their full potential, free of the medical, free of the psychosocial consequences of epilepsy. Now, the musical segue, and the special part of this program. Turning from art to music. Well, music, too, can inspire us and broaden our perspectives on epilepsy and its personal impact. I would now like to introduce Cynthia Folio, Associate Professor of Music Theory at the Boyer College of Music and Dance. She's a doctor, but at Temple University in Philadelphia. Cynthia's daughter, Lydia, who's coming to the podium with Cynthia, has epilepsy. And Cynthia will say a few words about her composition, When the Spirit Catches You, which we will hear performed for its Baltimore and its American Epilepsy Society Premiere. Cynthia.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank AES and Dr. Schachter for inviting us, also for the Relâche Ensemble for coming down from Philadelphia to perform today. And I'd like to thank my husband for helping me with the video aspects of my piece, Alec Brinkman. This is my daughter, Lydia Thompson. She has tuberous sclerosis and intractable seizures, and I've watched her have thousands of seizures throughout her life, and always wondered what it felt like. When I was attending an epilepsy camp, I got hold of the Brainstorm series, which they basically gave to all of us. And in reading that, at the same time I had a commission from the Relâche Ensemble, and I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do. I decided I've got to write a piece about seizures. And then I contacted Steve, and I said, look, I'm using some clips out of your Brainstorm books. Is that okay? And he said, yeah, that's great. It sounds wonderful. And did you know that I'm working on a book? It's about to be published on artwork by people with epilepsy. Wouldn't it be cool if you not only had the music, but you also had a visual aspect to the piece? So at that point, the piece changed direction. I had actually started on it. And as soon as I got the artwork from artists, I started to change my music to match the art. So it really influenced me a lot. The voice that you'll hear throughout is Lydia's voice. And the quotes are from the Brainstorm series. And the artwork is from people with epilepsy who are featured in his book, Visions. The piece is in 3 parts. The first part is aura, and the second part is the seizure itself, and the third part is post-ictal. And writing this piece has been empowering for me, and it's also been empowering for Lydia as well to hear her voice over the loudspeaker. So I hope you enjoy it.
whole body spins to one side. I get this tingling feeling in my feet. I feel tightness in my chest.